All right. Hello, everybody. I hope we're all doing really well. Um, so today we are going to be going over cosmological arguments for God's existence, right? So for the next 2 days, we're going to be talking about different versions of the Kalam argument for God's existence. All right. Oh, no. So have you ever wondered to yourself, why does the universe exist? Why is there something rather than nothing, right? Um, why are there minds? Why are there things? Why are there events? Why is any of this here? How is any of this here, right? These are philosophical questions, it turns out. So we might wonder, is there some explanation for why everything that exists is here, right? So cosmological arguments try to answer these kind of childlike questions that we might have. All right, so the cosmological argument is actually a family of different arguments, right? So we might say, so today we're going to be talking about cosmological arguments from contingency. That is, the presence of contingent things in the universe offers some reason to think that there's a necessarily existent being, namely God, that causes or explains the existence of all contingent beings. Now, contrast that style of cosmological argument with Kalam cosmological arguments, which assert or argue that the universe has a beginning. They take that as a premise, right? So the distinction between Kalam cosmological arguments and what we might call non-Kalam cosmological arguments, such as the argument from contingency, is that the Kalam cosmological arguments have as a premise that the universe began to exist. Whereas non-Kalam arguments, for example, the argument from contingency, do not have it as a premise that the universe began to exist. That's an important distinction. So today, we're going to be talking about one example of a non-Kalam argument, cosmological argument, namely the argument from contingency. Okay, and there's this third brand of cosmological arguments that say that a necessarily existent being best explains the existence of non-contingent things. So this is what we might call inference from to the best explanation, right? So given the two options, we go with the option that best explains the phenomenon that we're trying to explain. Um, an argument from the best explanation can either be a Kalam or non-Kalam argument. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. Okay. So there's a YouTube video if you're interested in seeing a little bit more about the cosmological argument, go there. This argument is very old, but is really made famous by Leibniz, who co-discovered calculus with Isaac Newton. So entering into this discussion, there's a lot of people who have spilled a lot of ink or written a whole lot of stuff about these arguments. And so if these arguments are true, they give us some reason to think that God exists. And so there seems to be a lot at stake here, right? An atheist wants to show that these arguments don't work. A theist wants to show that these arguments do work. And so there's going to be a lot of attention directed at these arguments. So here's some background from the reading. I'm sorry, my face is kind of annihilating some of the text here. I recommend that you download these PowerPoints and look at them so that you don't have me getting in the way of reading the rest of the PowerPoint, right? Okay, so the argument says that contingent things are best explained by the existence of something that's necessarily existent. Okay, so we have to get into a little bit of terminology here. So we talked either last time or the time before about necessarily existent things and contingently existent things. So let's make this distinction a little bit more clear. Um, a contingent thing is something that need not have existed at all. These things usually, uh, but not always, have a beginning and they have some ending, right? So, for example, this coffee mug, Fiestaware, is a contingent thing, right? Well, why is it contingent? You might ask. Well, this coffee mug has not always existed, right? It came into existence. It was made by a person or by a factory or a collection of persons, right? So it has some beginning, right? We can also say that this mug can go out of existence, right? I could drop it on the ground, destroy it, right? Crumple up all the little pieces, turn it into a non-mug, right? And so the mug has a kind of lifespan, comes into existence, it goes out of existence. We also can entertain the possibility that it never existed at all, right? We can say, well, okay, they made 10,000 Fiestaware mugs like this one. We could say it's possible that they only made 9,000 mugs like this one. And perhaps this mug is one of the ones that's from 9 to 10,000, right? So this mug could have never been made at all. We can entertain that. Perhaps Fiestaware isn't even a company at all. So there are no Fiesta mugs anywhere for anybody, right? That's possible. And so if it's possible that some being or something or some event not exist, it follows that that thing is in some sense contingent, right? So we might wonder, well, so I'm a contingent thing, you're a contingent thing, right? We come into existence, we go out of existence. It could have perhaps very easily been the case that we not exist, right? My father moved to Tennessee and married my mother because of a car dealership deal, right? Um, if my father never would have had that deal, right? If things would have worked out better for him back in Kansas City, well, it means that my dad never would have met my mother and I never would have existed, right? So it's possible that I not exist. So, relevant question. Is God a contingent thing or a necessarily existent thing, right? Does God's existence depend on something else? Did God begin to exist? Is God going to die and not exist anymore? Is it possible that God not exist at all, right? Um, so, a relevant question, is God contingent or is God necessary? So we might say, what is a necessarily existent thing? Well, a necessarily existent thing is, there we go. A necessarily existent thing is a thing that doesn't begin to exist. It doesn't go out of existence. It doesn't come into existence. And it's impossible for that thing to not have existed. If a necessarily existent thing exists, then it must exist. It's impossible for it to not exist, right? So theists want to say that God exists non-contingently. That is, his very existence is irremovable, right? He has to exist. We can't imagine a state of affairs where God does not exist. Folks also want to say that God's properties are also necessarily existence. That is, where we have God, we also have all of his properties, things like omniscience or omnipotence or omnibenevolence, right? All of these features about God are themselves necessarily existent, right? So where you have, it's impossible for God to not have existed, and it's impossible for God not to be the way that God is. Okay, so you've heard this like God is dead business from Nietzsche, right? If God is necessarily existent, then God cannot literally die in any kind of way, right? Um, he always has existed, forever will exist, necessarily must exist. Um, so good. So let's think about how we're going to use these terms in the cosmological argument. So we're trying to get from the existence of contingent things to the conclusion that God exists as a necessary thing, right? Okay. So here's the construal from the Wood text, and we're just gonna talk about each premise of this argument. So premise one: everything that exists contingently requires an explanation for its existence. Okay. So my coffee mug, right? It is a contingently existing thing. But we can give some explanation for why it exists, right? There are questions that we can answer about how it came to exist, right? Fiesta Ware was running this new line of red mug. This is a mug that came from that line, right? And so the line that Fiesta Ware was running explains the existence of this mug, right? Okay. So everything, not just the mug, but everything that exists contingently, right? The plants, the stars, the rocks, me, all of the technology in the world, Bill Gates, all of these things require some explanation or have some explanation for why they exist. Okay, so the material universe, everything that is, right, itself exists contingently, right? So the idea is that the universe, everything that is, all material objects, right, or we might refer to as just the universe, is also contingent. So it follows that the universe, as a contingent thing, itself requires an explanation from premises two and or one and two. Um, premise four is that nothing that's contingent can explain its own existence. And so the universe does not explain its own existence. We'll see a little later, but I'll start talking about it now. If something could explain its own existence, that means that that thing would have to exist before it existed, right? So suppose I were to cause my own existence. Well, if I say that I cause my own existence, then that presupposes that I existed before I began to exist, right? That seems to be a contradiction. There's a problem with that. So it seems like contingent things cannot explain themselves. Okay, if that's the case, if premise four is true, then the universe itself does not explain its own existence. Okay, premise six, the existence of the contingent universe cannot adequately be explained by more contingent things. We're going to talk about this premise in quite a lot of detail, right? But we might say that, okay, the whole universe can be explained by another contingent thing. Okay, well, we might also say that that contingent thing requires some explanation. So there's some other contingent thing. But that thing also needs an explanation. And so it goes on and on and on. Contingent things explaining other contingent things infinitely. That's one way that we can construe the explanation of the universe, without invoking a necessarily existent being, right? But this premise is ruling that possibility out. And so we come to the conclusion that a necessarily existent being or a non contingent being must explain the universe. Okay. And that non-existent or non or that uh, non-contingent or necessarily existent thing is God. Okay, let's see here. So let's talk more about premise one. Everything that exists contingently requires an explanation for its existence. Okay, so for example, right? You might ask, hey, there's a fire in your basement. Why? And I say, well, there's a fire in my basement. The fire is itself contingent, but we can explain why the fire's there. So suppose my uncle is smoking a cigarette and he flicks the cigarette onto a pile of dirty laundry that's in my basement. All of a sudden, the laundry catches and the whole basement is on fire. We might say, well, where'd that fire come from? Well, I could say, well, hey, my uncle was smoking a cigarette. He foolishly threw it down into a pile of dirty laundry, and the pile of dirty laundry combusted, right? And so we can explain the existence of the fire. The fire doesn't just come into existence. Rather, the fire must be explained by something else, right? And there is something else that does explain it, namely my uncle flicking the cigarette onto the dirty laundry, right? Okay, so when we say that everything or every contingent thing specifically requires an explanation for its existence, we are asserting what's called the principle of sufficient reason. Um, the principle of sufficient reason says that every contingent fact must have an explanation for its existence, right? Everything that is can be properly and fully explained by something else. Um, so why think that this is true? Can't we have some some contingent thing that has no explanation of its existence? Maybe so. I think that that's very much possible. However, we might wonder, well, what is that contingent thing, right? We can't really identify any single thing that rules out this generalization, right? Any contingent thing we point to is going to have some kind of explanation for its existence, right? Uh, Even if we don't know it, right? Even if it's something that, say, we scientifically we haven't discovered yet, strongly seems that it does have some explanation for its existence. So premise one seems at least somewhat plausible, right? We can debate. People are debating these all the time, but premise one, at least right now, seems to be relatively plausible. Okay, so the idea here is that every contingent thing must have an explanation of its existence. Not everything. If we say everything must have an explanation for its existence, then we're including necessary things, right? So, why does God exist? We might ask, right? Um, well, because of blah, 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 blah. No, no, no. We don't need to give an explanation for God's existence. Why? Well, because God is necessarily existent, right? The claim is that all the contingent things, all the plants, coffee mugs, instructors, students, all of those things have explanations for their existence. Um, So, for example, a candidate for a necessary truth is triangles have three sides, right? Uh, there's no way for that not to be true, right? That's always true, no matter what. At least people say so. If that's true, then we might say, well, why does a triangle have three sides? What explains that? That's not even really the right question, right? When we're talking about a necessary thing. So the same thing is with God. Well, why does God exist? Who created God? Like this and that. Um, that's not even the right question, because we're talking about a being that couldn't not have existed, right? That must exist. When we have a being or a proposition or a claim that's necessarily existent, that means that those things don't require explanations in the way that contingent things do. Okay, so that's just a clarification about this premise that's really important. All right, let's move on to premise two. The material universe, as a collection of all contingent things, exists contingently. Okay, so the idea here is that everything that exists, um, everything contingent that exists must exist, must have some explanation. Sorry, the material universe is itself a contingent thing. That's what we're talking about here, right? Okay, so we might think, so this in the parentheses here, the material universe as the collection of contingent things exists contingently, right? So David Hume, very famous Scottish philosopher, uh, thinks that this is an implausible premise, right? Okay, so we might say this is an argument in support of premise two, right? So we might say the material universe is the collection of all material things. All material things exist contingently, right? The universe is made up of me, you, this mug, this glass of water, everything that's out in my yard, all of these things, right? And so that means, and all of these things are contingent. So that means that the universe itself is also contingent. So Hume thinks that this style of reasoning for premise two falls prey to the fallacy of composition. So the fallacy of composition says that, look, just because all of the parts of a thing share a certain feature, it does not follow that the whole shares that feature, right? Okay, so consider this. I am composed of atoms, right? A lot of atoms make up your instructor. Those atoms are invisible, right? And so all of the parts of me are invisible. So it follows that I too am invisible. That's not a great, that I am not invisible, right? Like that's not true, right? So just because all of my parts share some feature, it does not mean that I too, the whole of those parts, also shares that feature. We might say my car is made out of parts. Each part weighs less than 1 pound. Just suppose that's true. Well, fallacy composition says that, well, your car doesn't weigh 1 pound too. I would be wrong to say, well, just because all the parts of my car weigh less than a pound or 1 pound, my car also weighs 1 pound or less than a pound. You would say, no, doesn't work that way, right? Car weighs more than a pound. And so I would be falling prey to the fallacy of composition there. Okay, and so similarly, just because the universe, which is composed of all material things that are contingent, just because all of the material things that make up the universe are themselves contingent, it doesn't follow necessarily that the universe itself is contingent, right? We're making a similar mistake to the car in atom examples, right? Okay, so premise two seems to be in trouble. How can we defend premise two from Hume's objection? Well, here are three ways that we can defend premise two from Hume's objection. Well, number one, we have what we might call an intuition, right? So in philosophy, our intuitions are often good reason to accept some claims, right? So consider the following philosophical claim, for example. Nothing exists, right? That's a philosophical claim. Well, we might say that that claim is really counterintuitive. Look, this seems to exist, and this seems to exist, and I seem to exist. And so it's intuitive that things exist. And because it's intuitive, we may have some reason to reject the claim that nothing exists. Okay, so we might say that there is some intuition to think that the material universe need not have existed, could have not existed, right? And so if that intuition is right, then the universe is contingent. That is, that gives some support for premise two, for thinking that the universe is itself a contingent thing. The other thing is that no philosopher, no atheist philosopher, no theist philosopher, no philosopher says that the universe is a necessarily existent thing. This claim is very, very difficult to support. All right, in way three, we might think, we might change how we argue from these this fallacy of composition, right? So rather than saying that, well, all the parts of my car weigh 1 pound, therefore my car also weighs 1 pound. We might say that, okay, all the parts of my car weigh 1 pound. Therefore, we have some reason to think that the car is also 1 pound, right? We have some evidence to think that the car is 1 pound, right? Even though the car's not 1 pound, that might give us some reason to think that the car is 1 pound, right? So we might think that if all of the parts of a thing share a feature, that gives us some reason or some evidence to think that the whole also shares that feature. And so that it can be wrong sometimes, it can be right other times. So the machine is a collection of parts. Each part weighs more than an ounce. And so that gives us some reason, or it's likely that the machine also weighs more than an ounce, right? And so this will work sometimes, this won't work other times, right? So we might think that the universe is composed of contingently existent things. That makes it likely, or that gives us some reason to think that the universe itself is a contingent thing too. So these are three ways in which we can sidestep Hume's fallacy of composition in defense of premise two. All right. So now we're at premise three. Okay, so premises one and two, everything that exists every contingent thing requires an explanation for its existence. The material universe exists contingently, so it follows that the universe requires some explanation. So if premises one and two are true, it just follows logically that premise three is also true. Okay. Well, let's suppose that, so if premises 1 or 2 are false, we lose support for premise 3, right? We don't get to have premise 3 unless premises 1 and 2 are true. But could we give some support to premise 3 independently of premises 1 and 2, right? Um, so some philosophers reject premise 3. Bertrand Russell says that there's the universe and that's it, right? The universe just is, and it requires no explanation for its existence. We can give no reasons why the universe exists. It just simply is in existence, and that's great. Um, so, so if that's the case, then the universe does not require an explanation for its existence, right? And so this argument doesn't work. But we might wonder, let's try to respond to Bertrand Russell here. Um, might raise a couple of different points here. Um, here's one thing. Okay, well, the material universe does seem to cry out for an explanation of its existence. Um, I mean, it's possible that it does not have any explanation, but it does seem to give us the feeling that it has some kind of explanation, right? We can ask, well, why is there a universe? Why is there something rather than nothing, right? So even if we don't know what the explanation is, it does seem, at least to some, maybe to some of us, right, that looking at the universe seems to invoke, like, yeah, there's something else that explains why all this is here, right? Um, and so so we can ask about the universe, but we don't ask about the universe in the same way that we ask about 2 + 2 is 4 rather than 5, right? That seems like a weird question. What explains why 2 + 2 is 4 rather than 5? It doesn't invoke the same kind of question, at least not to me. I don't know, it might to you. We can talk about that. But so we might think that the universe just seems to cry out for some kind of response or some kind of explanation, right? So consider an analogy. Suppose you found an intricate machine or an insect colony, right? I mean, would you just say, hey, that's just here? There's no reason why it's here, no explanation, can't give any reasons for it. It just is, right? Or would you say, well, maybe the ants built that colony, maybe somebody built that machine, right? You would try to give answers. So you look at the intricacies of the universe, right? Everything that is. And you say, do you look at it and you say, no reason why it exists, it just exists, it's just here? Or do you say, well, no, there must be some reason why it's all here? And we might all have different intuitions on this, but the point here is that we're trying to identify that it does seem intuitive to think that the universe has some reason for its existence or some explanation of its existence. So that's the first way where we might defend premise 3. The other explanation that we can give for premise 3, or defense of premise 3, is we could say that, look, all of the other material things have some explanation for their existence, right? The mug, the instructor, the student, the outside, everything that's in the screen behind me, all of it has some explanation. So why think that the universe is somehow an exception, right? Um, why think that the universe is different in some way? Well, all of a sudden, Russell seems to need to give a little bit more defense of his view, right? He can't just say that the universe is just here and that's that, right? he needs to give us some reason to think that the universe does not require an explanation, right? Um, and so if Russell does not give us more of an explanation, then we don't have any reason to accept his claim about the universe. It seems in some way arbitrary. All right, let's move on. All right, let's talk about premises 4 and 5. Okay, no contingent thing explains its own existence. We talked a little bit about that. All right, so it follows from premise 4 that the universe does not explain its own existence. So for point 1, we could say that, okay, let's suppose the universe has a beginning. If the universe has a beginning, right, then the universe can't cause its own existence, okay? So think about me. I'm a contingent thing. I did not make myself exist, right? My existence is explained by other contingent things. Things cannot just bring themselves into existence. Contingent things, at least, cannot bring themselves into existence. Well, why is that? Well, that's because I'm assuming that I exist before I exist, right? If I bring myself into existence, that means that I existed in order to bring myself into existence. But if I am bringing myself into existence, that means that I don't exist, right? It's like confusing, right? Um, if so, I have to be brought into existence by something else, right? And so contingent things, all contingent things, can't bring themselves into existence, because if they did that, it presupposes that they already existed before they existed. Like it's like a circle, right? Um, and so if we understand that the universe is a contingent thing, um, well, then the universe can't explain its own existence. There's got to be something else that explains its existence. Okay, so that's if we understand the universe as having a beginning, right? But like, what if the universe has no beginning, right? What if it's like an infinite series of things and events that just go all the way into the past and all the way into the future, right? Well, this is what we'll call the universe as understood as an infinite series. An infinite series of things and events and things and events that go on and on and on and on. Okay, the infinite series itself, right? Taking the whole universe as an infinite series of things and events, that itself needs an explanation, right? So that is like, why is there an infinite series rather than no infinite series, right? Um, well, we might say, well, because of something else, right? Um, we have to identify something that's outside of that infinite series to explain why there is an infinite series rather than no infinite series. Um, and so the claim here is that if the universe has a beginning, it cannot explain its own existence. Even if the universe has always existed, it has not, or it does not explain its own existence. So these are two ways to defend premises 4 and 5, the deduction from 4 and 5. Oh yeah. All right. Now let's chat about premise 6. Um, the existence of Zoom is in the way of this premise here. The existence of contingent things cannot adequately be explained by additional contingent things. Um, that's funny that I can't see the premise. Okay, consider a possibility similar to premise two, or not premise two, but similar to point two in the last slide. Um, okay, maybe the universe is adequately explained by other contingent things, right? So we let's say we have the universe here, and the universe is explained by some other contingent thing. Okay, well, that contingent thing is explained by this other contingent thing, and then that contingent thing is explained by some other contingent thing, on and on and on and on and on and on forever, right? In SpongeBob, he asks a mailman, he was like, "Who delivers your mail? Does another mailman deliver your mail? Is there an infinite line of mailmen delivering mail to other mailmen?" Right. This is kind of an ad infinitum of infinite line of mailmen delivering mail to other mail people. Right. So that mail person needs a mail person to deliver his mail, and then that mail person needs a mail person to deliver her mail, and then on and on and on. So we might say that, okay, we have the universe, we could just identify other contingent things that explain the universe ad infinitum, on and on and on forever. Okay? Premise 6 denies that possibility, right? The existence of contingent things cannot adequately be explained by other additional things, right? So it's not just an infinite chain. I'm going to move my face. So, as we've already said, is that those contingent things with themselves need explanations. And so we'd have an infinite chain of explanations for the universe, right? Um, so we might think that this is plausible, right? Um, okay, so with David Hume, an infinite series would explain everything that's in the universe, right? But the problem is that the infinite series of contingent things itself is not adequately explained. That is, why is there an infinite series of contingent things explaining other contingent things rather than nothing, right? Rather than no infinite series at all, right? So even if we say that the universe is explained by a set or a series of contingent things, that infinite set needs an explanation itself, right? And so it does not, the infinite series does not adequately explain the universe. And so it follows that we need some necessarily existent or non contingent thing to explain the existence of the universe, right? So that means that the conclusion follows from all of these premises, right? So we need the existence of a God or something like God in order to explain why there's a universe rather than nothing, right? Um, this is a lot of information, and I get it. Like this is a lot to take in. Just read through the wood section, right? Uh, Slowly, right? I'm going to pull questions from this lecture, from the PowerPoint, from the reading, and these will all be on your exam. So be sure and study all this stuff really thoroughly. Think through this video, watch it again if you need to. Um, for next time, we're going to be talking about the Kalam cosmological argument, right? It's going to be a little bit easier than this one. So we hit it hard today, and next time, even with this information in the background, for next time, it will be, I think, a little bit easier for everybody. So, but yeah, if you have questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. Um, like I said, this material is pretty dense, right? And there's a lot of terminology here, but you guys are smart. I know you can handle it. Let's see. The other thing that we should say is that we can talk about this, frame this argument as an inference to the best explanation too, right? So the conclusion, the universe must be explained by a non-contingent thing. It's like a super strong claim, right? We can weaken the claim and say the universe is best explained, the existence of the universe is best explained by a non-contingent thing. Or we have some reason to think that the universe is best explained by a non-contingent thing, right? The evidence favors a non-contingent thing over a contingent thing. That these stuff. So we can modify the argument and weaken the conclusion, right? Because when we have a conclusion that's really strong, we open ourselves up to criticisms, right? Whereas if we weaken it, we can kind of have our cake and eat it too. So let's see. I think that's the end. Yeah, that's the end. So I'm going to stop here. Let me know if you have questions, concerns. Just get through this material. Think about it. Think about how we defended each premise and try and understand each premise. Take this argument just one bite at a time. I know you can do it. All right. Goodbye, everybody.